he will be judged not by his election results, but by his administration and what he gets done.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus. And on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, I catch up with Nancy Solomon, Managing Editor of New Jersey Public Radio. We spoke just before Election Day about Governor Phil Murphy's chances to win a second term. A new poll out that day showed Murphy comfortably ahead. That was then. Now we know that Murphy barely eked out a win over Republican Jack Ciatterelli in an election full of surprises. And the powerful state Senate president also lost that day in a stunning upset. Well, to find out what happened and what comes next, we've called Solomon up again. She joins us now. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ian.
So as we speak here, Jack Ciatterelli has not yet conceded the race, right?
That's right. And I think the Murphy campaign folks are getting more and more angry about it. They released a statement this morning saying that he's been mathematically eliminated, that the margin has now increased to 2.5 percentage points, and that he has really no path to victory, and that he is undermining the integrity of the election by continuing to not concede. So they're unhappy with him about that. But it really, it's for several days now, it's been pretty clear that there was no mathematical way he was going to pull this out.
What has he said about why he won't concede the race?
Well, he says he wants all the votes to be counted, which all the votes will be counted because of the mail-in voting that is something that Phil Murphy really got going during the pandemic, and now it's become a very popular way to vote. So it's very easy to do a mail-in ballot, and Democrats more than Republicans have embraced mail-in voting. So what you have then is this sort of lump of votes that get counted after the in-person election day voting. And those are heavily Democratic right now. That's sort of been the history of this type of vote over the last couple of years, and it certainly is true this year. So you have this big cache of mail-in votes that came in, the week of the election. Monday was the last day that they could be counted, and so there really is no path for him at this point. But that's what he's saying, and it sounds right. It sounds like, oh, sure, all the votes should be counted, but all the votes do get counted. This is about calling an election where mathematically there is no possibility of a win. So that's what doesn't sit right with Democrats when he says all the votes should be counted.
What does this outcome, a much closer race than was expected, change about Governor Murphy's second term now and what he can get done?
There's been a ton of speculation about this over the weekend. I think that it really remains to be seen whether this hurts Governor Murphy at all. I can tell you what he said in his victory speech, which he gave at 10 o'clock on Wednesday night, 24 hours later than the originally scheduled one. He said he will be judged not by his election results, but by his administration and what he gets done. And so, of course he would say that, but I think to some degree, I'm not sure, the whole mandate issue really holds water. I mean, the fact is the governor of New Jersey is a very powerful governor. He has a lot of ability to get things done with or without the legislature. He has line item veto over the legislature. And now because there was such a huge upset election night that nobody was expecting, which was the state Senate president went down, that really leaves like a huge, big open question about what the next 4 years are going to be like.
We had talked before the election about how it would buck historical trends for Governor Murphy to be reelected. A Democrat hadn't been reelected in many decades in New Jersey. He did survive that night, but as you just mentioned, the state Senate president lost the race to a vastly underfunded Republican opponent. What happened there?
Well, I think what we saw, particularly in South Jersey, and that's where the Senate president's district is, we saw a huge Republican turnout that just overwhelmed Democratic voters in that district and in other districts. So when you talk about South Jersey, you have to understand this is a very purple part of the state. It has a lot of registered Republicans. It has a lot of middle of the road independents and conservative Democrats. We saw the fight a couple years ago over Congressman Jeff Van Drew, who changed parties from Democrat to Republican because he refused to vote for the impeachment of Donald Trump. Seems like ancient history now, but it was only a couple years ago. In South Jersey, you have the potential for Republican victories anyway. And what you had there was a guy who nobody paid any attention to, literally. I mean, there was no coverage of him. There was no spending on that race. I think Sweeney was, he was attending North Jersey political meetings and fundraisers a week before the election because he thought he had it in the bag. And he probably, anybody would forgive him for that. This is a district in which in 2017, his last election, the teachers union was mad at him and poured $5 million into his race to unseat him, and he still won. So I think nobody was predicting that he was going to lose that race, but there was a huge Republican turnout. People were, they're angry about the Trump loss. They're angry about, perceived changes in our culture that they see on Fox News and they don't like this idea of critical race theory being taught in the schools, which it really isn't, but they don't like it and they think it is. There were issues that Jack Ciatterelli, the gubernatorial candidate, brought up around LGBT issues in schools and LGBT identity being taught to elementary school kids as as sort of these are the many kinds of families there are and people there are, and he sort of used that as a wedge issue. There were a lot of forces going on, and then you have progressive Democrats in South Jersey who are very upset with the party machine down there. They're very upset with Sweeney, so they weren't going to vote for him either. So he really walked into a buzzsaw there.
As we look at the election results last week in places like New Jersey and Virginia, there's been a lot of national speculation and debate over what it might say about the fortunes for the Democratic and Republican parties in 2022. Is there anything to learn from the Republicans' relatively strong night in New Jersey last week that we might apply to next year's midterms?
I think we're definitely going to see more of this. I don't have much advice to give anybody. I would just say that, these congressional districts that we have in South Jersey and in sort of the central middle part of the state, these are purple districts. They've always been purple districts. And we're going to see some very hard fought battles during the midterm elections. I don't think anyone doubts that. Does this mean that Murphy and New Jersey Democrats went too far to the left and this is a correction? That argument is being made. I'm not sure I buy that. I just think that there are national, tensions and politics at play here that are being, that affect everybody all over the country. And what we had in this case was an energized Republican base that came out to vote in much higher numbers than they normally do in an off-year election. So that really made the difference. And I think what we'll just see is a much more attuned and hard-fighting Democratic base in 2022 that will come up against this energized Republican base. And we're just going to see some very hard-fought elections.
That's Nancy Solomon, managing editor of New Jersey Public Radio. We spoke just before the election, and now we're catching up on some surprising results there in the Garden State. Nancy, thank you so much for your time and your reporting.
Thanks, Ian.
All right, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.